The night they erased her was the night she became untouchable. The Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a silent stop beneath the cascading lights of the Grand Regent Hotel, its polished black surface reflecting 1,000 golden chandeliers like captured stars, and for a moment the entire entrance seemed to hold its breath as the driver stepped out with measured precision, opening the rear door with a quiet elegance that spoke of a world few were ever invited into, and then she emerged, Ava Brooks, draped in a gown that moved like liquid midnight against her skin, her posture effortless, her gaze steady, her presence commanding in a way that did not ask for attention but simply claimed it, and somewhere across the marble steps, Ethan Carter forgot how to breathe, because the woman stepping out of that car was not the woman he had left behind 3 years ago, not the girl who once stood uncertain in the shadow of his family's wealth, not the one who had quietly lowered her eyes under his mother's scrutiny. No, this woman carried silence like power. And it unsettled him in ways he could not explain. While beside him Margaret Carter's fingers tightened ever so slightly around her champagne glass, her expression composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to recognition, as whispers began to ripple through the gathered crowd, names spoken in hushed curiosity, speculation dressed as admiration, because everyone here knew power when they saw it, and Ava Brooks now wore it as if she had been born into it. Each step she took across the polished stone deliberate yet unforced, the soft click of her heels echoing like a quiet declaration that the rules had changed, that the story they thought they knew had rewritten itself without their permission, and yet as the camera flashes began to spark like distant lightning, Ethan's mind betrayed him, dragging him backward into a memory he had buried beneath logic and expectation. A memory of a different night, a smaller room, a quieter version of her standing just outside his family's estate, hands clasped tightly together as if holding herself steady against something invisible, her voice soft but unwavering as she asked him a question he had never truly answered, not with honesty, not with courage, because that night he had chosen silence over truth, status over love, and comfort over conviction, and he could still hear the echo of his own words, carefully measured, painfully cold, telling her that she deserved someone who belonged to her world, while knowing full well it was he who lacked the courage to step into hers. And the memory sharpened further, cutting into the present with the image of his mother standing just behind him, her voice smooth and practiced as she delivered her judgment like a verdict already decided, her smile polite but cutting as she reminded Ava, in front of guests who pretended not to listen, that some doors were not meant to be opened by everyone, that some lives required a certain refinement, and Ava had stood there, absorbing every word without interruption, without protest, her eyes steady, her silence heavier than any argument. Until finally she had nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, before turning away without asking for anything, without demanding explanation, without breaking, and that had been the moment Ethan convinced himself it was over, that she would disappear into the background of a life he no longer needed to consider. But now as he watched her step fully into the light, surrounded by a presence that bent the room toward her without effort, he realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that she had not disappeared at all, she had simply been rising somewhere he could not see, and as Ava lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes across the distance with a calm that held no anger, no plea, no trace of the past he thought defined her, only clarity, only distance, only the undeniable truth that she no longer belonged to any world he could control, the night shifted, and for the first time, Ethan Carter understood that losing her had never been the end of her story, it had only been the beginning of something far more powerful. The music inside the Grand Regent Hotel swelled into a soft orchestral rhythm, but for Ethan Carter, every note felt distant, as if the world had been wrapped in glass. And he was standing outside of it, watching a life he no longer understood unfold without him, because Ava Brooks had not just returned, she had redefined the space she entered, and it was impossible to ignore the way conversation shifted when she moved, the way powerful men subtly straightened their posture when she passed, the way even the event hosts adjusted their tone when addressing her, as though instinctively recognizing that she was no longer a guest but a force, and Ethan found himself stepping forward without thinking, drawn by something deeper than pride or curiosity, something unresolved, something he had buried under years of discipline and expectation, until now, when her presence unearthed it with quiet precision, and when he finally stood a few feet away from her, the distance felt heavier than any words he could form, because Ava did not rush to fill it, she simply turned her head slightly, acknowledging him with a composed glance that carried no trace of surprise, no tremor of the past, only a calm awareness that unsettled him more than anger ever could, and for a moment he searched her face for something familiar, some echo of the woman who once waited for him to choose her, but what he found instead was something far more dangerous, indifference shaped into elegance, and it forced him to speak before he could fully understand why, his voice lower than usual, stripped of the authority he was accustomed to, as he said her name like a question. He did not deserve answered, Ava, and she let the silence stretch just long enough to remind him that time no longer belonged to him before replying with a simple, measured, hello, Ethan, her tone polite, almost distant, as if addressing a stranger she once recognized but no longer needed to remember, and the shift in power was so subtle yet so complete that it left him momentarily unsteady. While behind him Margaret Carter approached with the same practiced grace she had perfected over decades of social dominance, her smile impeccable, her posture flawless, but there was something different now, something calculated beneath the surface as she looked Ava up and down, taking in every detail of the transformation she could not deny, the tailored confidence, the quiet authority, the unmistakable presence of someone who no longer sought approval, and for the first time, Margaret's voice carried a fraction of hesitation as she spoke, her words carefully chosen, Ava, what an unexpected surprise, and Ava met her gaze without flinching, her expression serene, her voice steady as she responded. Not everything valuable announces itself in advance, the sentence landing with a softness that somehow carried more weight than confrontation ever could, and around them the subtle tension began to draw attention, conversation slowing, glances lingering, because people sensed something unfolding that went beyond polite society, something rooted in history, in choices, in consequences, and Ethan felt it too, the undeniable realization that whatever he had once believed about control, about certainty, about who belonged where, was dissolving in the presence of the woman he had underestimated, and as a senior partner from a global investment firm approached Ava with visible respect, addressing her with a familiarity that suggested influence far beyond speculation, Ethan's understanding fractured further, because this was no coincidence, no accidental rise, this was intention, this was strategy, this was a life built without him, and perhaps in spite of him. And as Ava shifted her attention away from him with effortless composure, engaging in conversation that clearly existed on a level he had not been part of, Ethan stood there for a moment longer than he should have, caught between the man he had been and the truth he could no longer ignore, that the woman he once let walk away had not been waiting to be chosen, she had been becoming someone he would one day have to face without any power to change the outcome. The laughter around Ava rose and fell like a distant tide, polished and controlled, but beneath it there was a shift no one could quite name, a quiet recalibration of attention that followed her every movement, and as she spoke with the senior partner from Holstead Global, her voice carried a calm authority that did not need volume to be heard, each word measured, each pause intentional, as if she understood that true power was not in speaking more, but in saying only what mattered, and across the room Ethan remained still, his hand resting against the edge of a marble column, watching a version of her he had never taken the time to imagine, because the woman before him was not a product of luck or chance, she was the result of decisions made in silence, of nights no one witnessed, of doors she had opened without permission, and the realization settled into him slowly, like a truth that refused to be ignored, that the space she occupied now had been built without him, and perhaps because of him, and Margaret Carter, ever composed, adjusted the delicate bracelet on her wrist as she observed the same scene with a strategist's eye, her mind already working to understand the shift in dynamics, because she had spent a lifetime recognizing influence, and Ava Brooks now carried it in a way that could not be dismissed, not by anyone who understood how the world truly operated, and yet there was something else beneath Margaret's gaze, something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to regret, though she would never name it as such, and as Ava concluded her conversation with a subtle nod, the partner stepping away with clear respect, she turned slightly, her eyes catching the reflection of herself in the floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the city skyline, the light stretching endlessly into the distance like a reminder of how far she had come, and for a brief moment, the present dissolved, replaced by a memory she had not revisited in years, a smaller apartment with chipped paint and a single lamp casting soft light across a narrow desk, where she had once sat alone, her phone silent, her chest tight not from heartbreak but from something deeper, something colder, the realization that she had been seen as less, not because of who she was, but because of where she came from, and she remembered the way she had placed the phone down without calling him back, the way she had stood in that quiet room and made a decision that did not feel dramatic or triumphant, only necessary, that she would never again ask to be chosen, that she would build a life where her presence was not questioned but expected, and that decision had not been loud, it had not come with tears or declarations, it had come with stillness, with a steady breath, with the understanding that becoming would require more than emotion, it would require discipline. And now, standing in a room filled with people who once would have overlooked her, Ava exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the present, because she knew that this moment was not about proving anything, not to Ethan, not to Margaret, not to anyone watching with curiosity disguised as admiration. This moment was simply a reflection of who she had become, and as Ethan finally stepped forward again, his hesitation barely masked by practiced confidence, Ava did not move toward him, she did not retreat, she simply remained exactly where she was, steady, composed, untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with distance and everything to do with clarity. And when he spoke her name once more, softer this time, almost careful, it no longer held the weight it once did, because she had already rewritten the meaning of it in her own life, and whatever conversation he believed he was about to begin, Ava understood something he was only just starting to learn, that some chapters do not reopen, no matter how much someone wishes they could rewrite the ending. The air between them held a quiet tension that no one else could quite name, as if the room itself had begun to lean in, waiting for something that neither Ava nor Ethan seemed eager to give, and yet he stepped closer, drawn by a gravity he no longer controlled, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been when he spoke to her before, as though he understood, even now, that volume would not reach her. "Ava, can we talk?" And the question lingered between them not as a command but as a request, unfamiliar on his tongue, and Ava regarded him for a moment with a calm that was neither cold nor warm, simply present, the kind of presence that came from knowing exactly who she was and no longer needing anything from anyone else, before she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not an invitation, but not a refusal either, just enough to acknowledge that he had been heard, and they moved slightly away from the center of the room, not far enough to disappear from view, but just enough to create a space where words could exist without interruption, and Ethan exhaled slowly, as if preparing himself for something he could not fully predict. "I did not expect to see you here tonight," he began, the sentence careful, controlled, but lacking the certainty he once wore like armor, and Ava's response came without hesitation. "I was invited," her tone even, her gaze steady, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary, and it was in that simplicity that he felt the first fracture in the version of the past he had convinced himself was complete, because she did not owe him context, she did not offer him access, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight. "I heard about your work," he continued, searching for something neutral, something safe, something that might bridge a distance he had created. "You have done well," and for the first time, Ava allowed the faintest hint of a smile to touch her expression, not warm, not mocking, simply acknowledging the understatement of it. "I have done what was required," she replied, and the words carried a depth that reached far beyond achievement, and Ethan felt it, the unspoken truth beneath her calm, that everything she had built had come at a cost he had never witnessed, never shared, and perhaps never would, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of everything left unsaid, of choices made and consequences lived, and for a moment he almost said it, almost reached for the apology that had sat unspoken for years, but before he could, Ava spoke again, her voice still steady, still composed, but now carrying a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "You made the decision that worked for you, Ethan," and there was no accusation in her tone, no bitterness, only truth, and it struck him harder than any confrontation could have, because she was not asking him to explain, she was not asking him to justify, she was simply acknowledging what had already been done, and in doing so, she removed any illusion that the past could be renegotiated, and he nodded slowly, the movement almost automatic, because he could not argue with something that had been so quietly accepted. "I thought I was protecting something important," he admitted, the words measured, but now carrying a trace of honesty that had been absent before, and Ava tilted her head slightly, considering him not as someone she needed to understand, but as someone she observed from a distance. "Sometimes people protect the wrong things," she said. And there was no judgment in the statement, only a quiet observation that lingered long after it was spoken, and in that moment Ethan understood that whatever he had come here to find, whatever version of closure or connection he had imagined, it no longer existed in the way he remembered, because Ava was no longer standing in the space he had left her, she had moved beyond it entirely, and as the music shifted and the room slowly resumed its rhythm around them, the distance between them remained, not physical, but something far more permanent, something built not from anger, but from growth that had happened without him. Margaret Carter had not moved far, yet her presence returned like a carefully timed interruption, her heels silent against the polished floor as she approached with the same poised authority that had once filled entire rooms without question. But tonight there was a subtle recalibration in the way she carried herself, a precision that suggested she understood the stakes had shifted. And when she stopped beside them, her gaze settled on Ava with a level of attention she had never offered before. Not dismissive, not condescending, but measured, as if she were assessing something she could no longer afford to overlook, and her voice, when it came, was smooth as ever yet layered with a restraint that had not existed years ago. "Ava, it seems you have been very busy." The pause deliberate, the word chosen carefully, and Ava turned slightly toward her, her expression composed, her posture unchanged. Meeting Margaret's gaze without the slightest flicker of discomfort. "I have been focused," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not seek approval, it did not invite validation, it simply stated a fact that stood on its own, and Margaret inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the response while her mind moved quickly behind her calm exterior. "I imagine that focus has brought you considerable success," she continued, her tone still controlled, still elegant, but now edged with something that felt dangerously close to curiosity, and Ava allowed a brief silence before answering. Just long enough to remind them both that she no longer operated on anyone else's timeline. "Success is a byproduct," she said, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering. "What matters is what you build when no one is watching." And for the first time Margaret did not respond immediately, her expression holding, her gaze sharpening as if recognizing that this was no longer a conversation she could direct, while Ethan remained just slightly behind them, listening in a way he had never done before, not interrupting, not steering, simply absorbing the reality unfolding in front of him, and the dynamic was unmistakable. The balance of power had shifted so completely that even silence now belonged to Ava, and a nearby guest approached with visible hesitation, addressing Ava with professional familiarity. "Ms. Brooks, the board members are asking for you," the announcement subtle but unmistakable, carrying implications that rippled quietly through those close enough to hear, and Ethan's attention snapped fully to her, the words settling into him with a realization he could not ignore. Board members, not clients, not colleagues, but decision-makers, and Ava turned her head slightly, acknowledging the message with a calm nod. "I will join them shortly," she replied, her tone effortless, as if this level of influence was simply part of her world now, and when she looked back at Margaret, there was no tension, no lingering need to prove anything, only a quiet clarity that closed the space between past and present. "You were right about one thing," Ava said gently, her voice neither confrontational nor forgiving, just precise. "Some doors are not meant for everyone," and Margaret's expression stilled, recognizing the echo of her own words, and Ava held her gaze for a brief moment longer before continuing. "But sometimes, those doors lead to places much bigger than the rooms behind them," the sentence landing softly, yet carrying a truth that could not be undone. And without waiting for a response, Ava stepped away with the same measured grace she had arrived with, her presence leaving behind a silence that no one attempted to fill. And as she moved toward the inner circle of the gala, where influence gathered and decisions were made, Ethan remained where he stood, the distance between them no longer something he could close, while Margaret Carter, for the first time in years, found herself without a response, her certainty replaced by something unfamiliar, the quiet understanding that the woman she once dismissed had not only walked through the door she tried to close, she had built an entirely new one beyond her reach. The inner circle of the gala was quieter, not because there were fewer people, but because every conversation carried weight, decisions layered beneath polite smiles and measured tones, and as Ava stepped into that space, the shift was immediate, subtle yet undeniable. Chairs angled slightly toward her, voices lowering in respect, eyes acknowledging her presence not as a guest but as someone whose opinion mattered. And she moved through it with calm precision, greeting each board member by name. Her voice steady, her posture effortless, as though she had always belonged in rooms where power was not displayed but exercised, and from a distance Ethan watched, his understanding deepening with every passing second, because this was no longer speculation, this was confirmation. Ava Brooks was not simply successful, she was influential. And the realization settled into him with a quiet finality that made it impossible to return to the version of her he had once held in his mind, while Margaret stood beside him, her expression composed but her gaze fixed, studying Ava not with judgment but with something far more complex, recognition layered with calculation, as if she were reassessing an entire narrative she had once believed to be complete. And for the first time in years, Margaret Carter was not the one defining the room, she was observing it, adapting to it, and that shift, though invisible to most, was profound, because it meant that even she understood the balance had changed, and as Ava engaged in a discussion about an upcoming investment initiative, her voice carried clarity and direction, outlining strategy with a confidence that did not need to dominate to be followed. And one of the senior board members nodded in agreement, his tone respectful. "We trust your judgment on this, Ava." The statement simple, yet loaded with implication, and Ethan felt it, the weight of those words, because trust at that level was not given lightly. It was earned over time, through consistency, through results, through a reputation built where no one was watching, and he realized then that everything she had become had been happening quietly, beyond his view, beyond his influence, and perhaps beyond anything he could have imagined. And as the conversation concluded, Ava offered a small nod, acknowledging the consensus without lingering in it, because she did not need recognition to validate what she had already secured, and when she turned slightly, her gaze briefly passing over Ethan and Margaret once more, there was no hesitation, no second thought, only a calm awareness that they were now part of a chapter she had already closed. And yet Ethan felt compelled to step forward again, drawn not by hope this time, but by something closer to understanding, a need to say what had remained unspoken for too long, and as he approached, Ava paused, not out of obligation, but out of choice, allowing him a moment that he had once taken for granted, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the certainty it once did, only honesty stripped of pretense. "I was wrong," the word simple, but heavier than anything he had said that night. And Ava regarded him quietly, her expression unchanged, her silence neither inviting nor dismissing, simply present, and for a moment it seemed as though the room itself had softened around them, the noise fading just enough to allow the truth to exist without distraction, and Ethan continued. Not rushing, not defending, just stating what he had finally come to understand. "I thought I knew what mattered, I thought I was choosing the right path, but I did not see you clearly." And Ava listened, not with expectation, not with resentment, but with a calm that came from no longer needing anything from the past, and when he finished, the silence returned, not empty, but complete, and she spoke with the same quiet precision that had defined her presence all evening. "You saw exactly what you were ready to see, Ethan," and her words were not harsh, they were not soft, they were simply true, and in that truth there was no space left for regret to change anything, because the moment had already passed. And as Ava turned away once more, stepping back into the world she had built with intention and clarity, Ethan remained where he stood, not broken, not defeated, but finally aware, and Margaret Carter, standing beside him, felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not loss, but the quiet understanding that power, when misunderstood, could slip away without warning, and that the woman she once dismissed had not only risen, she had redefined what it meant to belong. The evening continued with a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely changed, as if the same room now operated under different rules, quieter ones, deeper ones, and Ava moved through it with an ease that did not seek attention yet naturally drew it, her presence no longer a surprise but an established fact, something the room adjusted around rather than questioned. And as she stepped toward the balcony where the city stretched endlessly beneath a velvet sky, the cool air brushing lightly against her skin, there was a stillness in her expression that spoke not of distance but of completion, the kind that comes when something once unresolved has finally found its place, and behind her, through the tall glass doors, Ethan remained where she had left him, his reflection faint against the lights of the city, watching not with longing, not with expectation, but with a clarity that had taken him far too long to reach. And Margaret Carter stood beside him in silence, her posture still perfect, her composure intact, yet there was no mistaking the shift in her gaze, the absence of certainty that had once defined her every judgment, because even she could see it now, the truth that had unfolded without her permission, that Ava Brooks had not risen within their world, she had created one that did not require their approval, and that realization carried a weight that could not be dismissed with elegance or explanation. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence between mother and son reflecting something unspoken yet understood, that what had been lost was not simply a relationship, but a possibility they had failed to recognize when it mattered. And as the music softened inside, Ava rested her hand lightly against the cool railing, her gaze steady as it traced the horizon, not searching, not remembering, simply present, and the city below pulsed with quiet energy, a reminder of everything she had built beyond the confines of a single decision, a single night, a single rejection, and when the door behind her opened, she did not turn immediately, not out of avoidance, but because she no longer felt the urgency to react, to anticipate, to brace herself for what might come next, and Ethan stepped out slowly, stopping a few feet away, respecting a boundary he had once ignored without realizing it, and his voice, when it came, was softer than the night around them. "I did not understand what you were becoming," and Ava closed her eyes briefly, not in pain, not in reflection, but in acknowledgement of a truth that no longer held power over her, before she replied with quiet clarity, "You were not meant to," and there was no bitterness in her tone, only acceptance, the kind that releases rather than binds, and Ethan nodded, the movement small, almost invisible, as he absorbed the finality in her words, not as rejection, but as reality, and for the first time, he did not try to change it, did not try to reach for something that no longer belonged to him, and instead he simply stood there, understanding that some distances are not measured in steps, but in time, in growth, in the quiet decisions that shape who we become, and Ava turned then, meeting his gaze one last time, her expression calm, her presence unwavering, and in that moment there was nothing left unresolved between them, nothing left to explain, because everything that needed to be understood had already been lived, and as she offered a small, composed nod before stepping back inside, returning to the world she had built with intention and grace, Ethan remained on the balcony, the city stretching before him, vast and indifferent. And for the first time, he understood that what he had once seen as an ending had only ever been the beginning of something he had not been strong enough to follow. When Ava stepped back into the ballroom, the energy seemed to recalibrate once more, but this time there was no surprise left, only recognition, the kind that settles quietly and stays, and the orchestra shifted into a softer arrangement as if the evening itself understood that something had already reached its peak, and Ava moved with the same composed grace, acknowledging a few final conversations, offering measured smiles that carried warmth without invitation, her presence now fully integrated into the rhythm of the room she had effortlessly claimed, and across the space Margaret Carter remained still, her gaze following Ava not with scrutiny, but with a depth that had not existed before, because for the first time she was not evaluating, not correcting, not dismissing, she was understanding, and that understanding came with a quiet weight she could not ignore, as if every word she had once spoken now echoed differently in her own mind, stripped of certainty, revealing something she had never allowed herself to consider, that she had not been protecting standards, she had been limiting vision, and the realization did not break her composure, but it changed it, softened the edges of a control she had worn for so long it had become indistinguishable from identity, and when Ava approached the exit corridor, her steps unhurried, her expression calm, Margaret moved forward, not quickly, not impulsively, but with intention, and when she spoke, her voice remained elegant, yet there was something undeniably sincere beneath it. "Ava, may I have a moment?" And the request itself was a shift, subtle but undeniable, because Margaret Carter had never asked for anything before, she had always expected it, and Ava paused, turning to face her with the same steady gaze that had carried her through the entire evening, not defensive, not guarded, simply present, and Margaret held that gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring her own words against a standard she was only now beginning to understand. "I misjudged you," she said, the sentence simple but carefully placed, and the admission did not come with apology wrapped in formality, it came with clarity, as if she had finally reached a truth she could not refine or reshape, and Ava listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, because she did not need the acknowledgement, but she respected its honesty, and Margaret continued, her tone softer now, though still composed. "I believed I understood what strength looked like, but I was wrong about that," and for a moment the distance between them shifted, not erased, not repaired, but acknowledged in a way that had never happened before, and Ava inclined her head slightly, accepting the words without absorbing them, because they did not define her, they never had, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, measured, and free of any need to balance the moment. "Everyone sees through their own lens, Mrs. Carter," she said gently, and Margaret gave a faint nod, understanding more than the words themselves, understanding that this was not a reconciliation, not a return, but a quiet recognition of what had already passed, and as Ava turned once more toward the exit, the soft glow of the corridor lights reflecting against the polished floor, there was no hesitation in her steps, no backward glance, because she had already carried everything she needed forward, and outside, the Rolls-Royce waited once again, its presence unchanged, steady, a reflection of the journey that had brought her here and would carry her further still, and as the driver opened the door, Ava paused for just a brief moment, not to remember, not to reconsider, but simply to breathe in the stillness of a chapter fully closed, before stepping inside with quiet certainty, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo far beyond the street, leaving behind a room that would remember her, not as the girl they once dismissed, but as the woman they could no longer define. The Rolls-Royce moved through the quiet city streets with a smooth, unbroken glide, the kind that made the outside world feel distant, almost unreal, and inside, Ava sat back against the soft leather, her reflection faint in the tinted window as the lights of the skyline passed like silent witnesses to everything she had become, and for a moment there was no sound except the gentle hum of the engine and the rhythm of her own breath, steady, grounded, unchanged by the evening that had just unfolded, because what had happened tonight was not a victory, not a conquest, not a moment she had waited for. It was simply confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement that she had outgrown a version of her life that once tried to define her limits, and she allowed herself a small pause, not to revisit the past, but to recognize the distance she had traveled from it, the long hours, the difficult choices, the discipline that had shaped her into someone who no longer needed to be understood by those who once misunderstood her. And as the car turned onto a quieter avenue lined with trees and soft streetlights, Ava closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in stillness, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim, only forward movement guided by clarity. And back at the Grand Regent Hotel, the absence she left behind had settled into something noticeable, not loud, not dramatic, but present, like a shift in temperature that no one could ignore. And Ethan Carter stood near the balcony doors, his gaze lingering on the place where she had last stood, not searching for her, not expecting her return, but understanding in a way he never had before that some things, once lost, do not circle back, they continue forward without you. And Margaret Carter remained composed beside him, yet quieter than she had ever been, her thoughts no longer anchored in certainty but in reflection, a rare and unfamiliar space where she could see, with clarity she had once resisted, that the woman she had dismissed had not needed their world to succeed. She had built one that operated beyond it, and for the first time, Margaret did not attempt to correct that realization. She accepted it, not as defeat, but as truth. And as the evening slowly dissolved into smaller conversations and departing guests, the grand room returned to its usual rhythm. But something had changed beneath the surface, something subtle yet lasting. Because the story people would carry from that night would not be about wealth or status or the spectacle of luxury. It would be about presence, about the quiet strength of a woman who had walked away without breaking and returned without needing to prove anything at all. And miles away, the Rolls-Royce came to a gentle stop in front of a modern glass residence overlooking the river, the city lights reflecting across its surface like a continuation of the sky itself. And Ava stepped out with the same composed grace, the night air cool against her skin, her heels soft against the stone walkway as she moved toward the entrance. And before stepping inside, she paused just once, looking out at the horizon, not with longing, not with memory, but with quiet certainty, because she understood something now that she had not known before, that closure does not come from being chosen, it comes from choosing yourself. And as the door closed behind her, the story that had once begun with rejection ended not with revenge, but with something far more powerful, a life built on dignity, shaped by resilience, and carried forward by a woman who no longer needed anyone to recognize her worth, because she had already defined it for herself.